On Target Institute presents a teaching from the Men on Target small group curriculum. Now with today's session, On Target founder Vince D'Acchioli.
Hello men, how you doing? Welcome to our review session for Module 3. We call these Growth Keys. This is an opportunity for you with the men at your table to sit down and review sessions 17 through 24 and ask yourself the question on a scale of maybe 1 to 10, how am I doing in these areas, so that we can kind of backfill when it comes to our efforts to really grow in these areas. And there'll be a handout available online. I want to encourage you to go there and get it. It's a special handout for these review sessions that allow you to also make notes of the other men in your group and some of their needs so that you can pray for them every day. So I want to encourage you to do that. Module 3, Growth Keys. The how and why sessions, and I've already said probably the most important module of all of them. We began by talking about the 3 unalterable facts. Do you remember those? Number 1, God knows us and created us for a purpose. Number 2, He has equipped us with special gifts toward the satisfaction of that purpose. And then number 3, God wants us to discover His purpose for our life. These are very, very important things for us to understand. Now, as we debrief these sessions, we began by talking about how am I wired? You remember that in session 17. And we talked about really drilling down in the areas of the 7 charismata, often referred to as motivational, natural, or personal gifts that are found in Romans. And the number 7 indicates the idea of completeness and wholeness. And we had you guys take the gift test in order to determine how God may have wired you in one or more of these areas. The 7 gifts are these: perceiver, teaching, giving, ministry, exhorting, administration, mercy. And we talked about how some of them are hard-sided gifts and some of them are soft-sided gifts. The perceiver and the administration and teaching tend to be on the hard side, where the other 4 are on the soft side. And if you remember, we contrasted those and talked about the implications of those depending upon maybe how God has wired you. In Proverbs 22:6, we use this verse. It says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and then even when he is old, he will not depart from it." I don't know if you really ever drilled down with that verse and discovered what it's really saying. Here, first of all, let me tell you what it's not saying. It is not saying to just simply train a child up in a good generic way, although it certainly implies that. What it's saying is that as students of our children, we're to really study them, determine how God has wired them uniquely, and train them up in that way. And I think you remember my suggesting to you that most of us were not exposed to that kind of parenting when we grew up. But it's very important for us to know how God has wired us uniquely. Now, how do I discover how I am wired? The 2 critical questions. And how do I discover God's purpose for my life? We kind of went from there into that direction. And we started with, how do I discover now my purpose? That came in session 19. Why am I here? Men are born with a sense of destiny and purpose. A man's greatest need is for significance. We talked about that. And we pursue this need, however, in different ways. Very important for us to understand that. We talked in that session about the 4 universal purposes of all of us. And then we talked about our unique calling. And the 4 universal purposes, if you remember, the universal purpose number 1 is that we are all called, every one of us, to build the kingdom, regardless of our unique gifts. We're called to do these 4 things: to build the kingdom. Number 2, to tend the culture. Number 3, to love the king, love God. And then number 4, to love the king's people. Loving God and loving the king, of course, we recognize that as the 2 greatest commandments. Very important for all of us to get that. And we talked about the 4 things that need to line up here about when it comes to how do I discover God's plan for my life. We talked about the need to make sure all 4 of these are in place before we move in a particular direction. Number 1, am I reading it in the Word? In other words, through prayer and pursuing God and asking Him to help unfold His unique plan for my life now, how do I discern it? First of all, is it jumping off the pages of the Word? Number 2, Am I hearing it by His Spirit? Do I hear God's voice speaking to me? And I don't know about you men, but that's always one of the hardest things for me to really get. Number 3, is it being affirmed through wise, godly counsel? And I really want to underscore wise, godly counsel. You can get a lot of counsel from different people, but you need to make sure that the people you're moving forward with their advice are godly people. And then number 4, is it consistent with current circumstances? Do you have the ability to make that physical move? Do you have enough money in place? Are you physically able to do the things that you think God's calling you to do? All of those kinds of things. And so then the next session had to do with understanding my responsibility. And if you remember, in this session, we also unpacked the whole idea of governing the cultural evolution. And I talked to you about the importance of understanding and being watchmen for what's going on in the world around us. But in session 21, understanding my responsibility, we talked about 3 things that we need to consider. Number 1 is that we need to know the call. In a generic sense, we all have a call on our life. Again, there are common purposes for all of us, and there are unique purposes. We need to know what those are. Number 2, we need to understand the terrain. That's the cultural evolution idea. Understand, be watchmen, understand what is going on around us. And guys, if you look at what's happening in our nation today, there's a lot of changes coming at us very, very quickly. We talked about how the world is having more of an influence on the church than the church is on the world, and that's very, very important for us to understand that and to discover how to counteract that as we move forward in the area of being different. Developing the kind of life that is different was something that we really talked about. In Colossians 4, 5, and 6, it says to be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. And then, of course, moving into session 22, we began to unpack that even further when we talked about what is my response. And if you remember, I kind of shotgun read a bunch of verses highlighting the word do. In Proverbs 21:3, it says, to do what is right and just is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. In 1 Peter 2:12, it kind of wraps all of this together where it's talking about keeping our behavior. Listen, guys, our behavior, not our words, our behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may be, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. And the idea here is, remember we talked about these things. Do you have a tendency are you imposing your faith or are you exposing your faith? Are you shining your light? We talked about when you shine the light, all people see is the glare. Guys, they don't really see Jesus. Are you shining your light or are you letting it shine? And then are you pulling weeds or are you planting seeds? Very, very important for us to understand how we approach people is really the key. And then in session 23, we talked about my attitude and my actions. And here is where we talked about the Pygmalion effect, which suggests that my attitude can sometimes get in the way of people becoming all that God intended, because we may already have a negative belief system about someone. That can really be something very, very problematic, and we drill down on how we can avoid that. And the bottom line is, we talked about how we are called, listen guys, to live a life that demands an explanation, so that when people look at us, they say, you know what, that person just did something that is unusual and it goes against the grain of what a normal person would do. And remember the illustration with Paul and Silas when the chains fell off and that guard ran in there and accepted Jesus, all because he saw something in Paul and Silas that, listen, confounded him. And guys, people need to see that in our life, stuff that confounds them. And then finally in session 24, we talked about the idea of what is my motive. And you may remember in that session, we talked about Larry Crabb and how he says in all human interaction, we're either ministering or manipulating. And I remember telling you that I went out and had some wristbands made. In fact, there's a slide on your screen showing them to you. And a reminder that if you really want one, you can go to otm.co, and there's a place where you can order some of those. The idea that in Proverbs 16:2, it says, a man plans his ways, but the Lord understands the motives of the heart. And we should ask ourselves always, what is my motive? Before I make that phone call, before I write that email, before I have that meeting, we'd get in a lot less trouble, men, if we ask ourselves that question. And you remember my motorcycle story. I was a pretty good manipulator in my life, and I don't want to ever do that anymore. So, what is the life implication and life application now of these sessions, of this whole module? Life implication: unless I understand how and why God made me and am living his vision out, I will never become the man God intended. We've talked about this. This is very important for us to understand. So here are your discussion questions. And on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you doing in these areas? How am I wired? How well do you know how God has wired you now that you've been through this? Why am I here? Well, how are you doing in the area of understanding God's purpose for your life? How about your responsibility? Do you really understand what your responsibility is? How are you doing in the way you respond to others? What would they say about you? How is your attitude and your actions out in the marketplace? And finally, how are you doing in the area of manipulation versus ministry? I want to encourage you, men, on a scale of 1 to 10, drill down in these areas, and let's go back now and pray about how we can improve in these very, very critical areas before we move on to the next module. Guys, I'm really praying for you. I hope this module really blessed you. And until next time, don't forget about it.